Salve omnes, I am Ruminus, and today we are talking about detrimental mechanics in video games. Assistive mechanics, which we mentioned previously, help the player, but these are obviously the opposites, which are detrimentals and reduce the player's capacities or abilities in some facet. Just like assistives, detrimentals also cannot be changed throughout the duration of the game, either by the player or the game itself. Now, these are designed usually to limit the player from easily dominating the game, like forcing a break after a combo so that the opponent has time to retaliate. Detrimentals are designed to make the experience more realistic, potentially, but more often than not, more challenging, rather than just letting the player become an unstoppable god of incredible force. Detrimentals can make the game harder by giving the game a more strategic component rather than just a hack and slash or a button masher feel. Detrimentals include the limit of mobility actions, such as jumping and dashing, the length of recoil after an attack, contact damage, range of attacks, and the speed of the character. Racing games often place a significant amount of detrimental effects onto the player to make the races harder and require skill rather than just driving forward. Normally, in older racing games, the other cars would typically win any collision or at least cause the player to lose control. I call this mechanic defense always wins, where, as it clearly tells, the defensive character or computer will always surpass the player if they do the same thing or in the similar action where they meet head on. This also happens in action games and fighters where the player can get grabbed or countered even if the player was in the middle of an attack. Fall damage and contact damage are often given to platformers as a way to prevent the player from storming through the level. These effects all change how the player has to think and react when playing against enemies or adversaries. Many detrimentals are designed specifically for combat and conflicts. Shooters will typically make the enemies have incredible accuracy, and stealth games will make all the enemies immediately aware of the player when spotted, even if the enemies are underground or on the other side of the planet.
There's someone here!
You did not— what the world? Bosses will typically have way more health than the player, or have abilities which the player cannot do. Although the player has a limited amount of special attacks, the enemies typically don't and may spam it, which is a problem and frustration when having detrimentals. It's fine if the bosses have these types of things, but don't make it too much. Tactical games may limit the resources on the player, but the enemies have unlimited supplies. Enemies may have invulnerability frames after a hit or during specific attacks. All of these are specifically included to make the player retreat or be more strategic than to just go in with guns down, fists up, let's go. Right back at you, pal. Hey, come on. You missed so much. I hate this game! Doom is famous for lacking many detrimental mechanics and letting the player just rip through everything. But Siphon Filter is just a regular dude who runs at normal speeds and climbs at slow paces, meaning that being caught by the enemies is usually a death sentence. There are detrimental effects which are not only focused on combat or damage. Traps may not always hurt the player, rather they may just impede the movement or cause a puzzle to reset or something along those lines, but they may also initiate a tense conflict. Chip's challenge, that's right, we're going way back, makes the player slide in a straight line on panels of ice, whereas Jack and Daxter just makes the player have faster speed and looser control while sliding over ice. Environmental traps, time to complete missions, reputation and reactions from NPCs, the amount of light, reducing sight while running are all examples of detrimental mechanics which don't revolve specifically around combat itself. Journey and other adventure games will sometimes have certain parts where strong gust of wind or something similar will push the player, sometimes completely backwards, to make the player take more time when going through a section or just to slow them down. Stealth games may increase the light to make the player more easy to detect. Enemies may become perpetually aware of the player's presence if they are ever spotted, making the enemies more quick to action and the paths less clear. All of these are focused on making the experience not entirely in the favor of the player and indeed adding some challenge to the game. One major detrimental mechanic which is prevalent in many games is the main character syndrome, which, like it says, means that the player's character is always the focus of the enemies, the combat, the challenges, or the missions. Harbinger, you're really getting me in my way here, man.
I'm the harbinger of your destiny.
And I'm the harbinger of yours. Even when there are allies or companions. This is often made clear by the game, as the enemies will completely ignore the allies who are punching them in the face because they know that the player is hiding behind that rock 30 miles away. Ow, 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 ow. Can't you fire on somebody else? There's a drone right next to you! Shoot at him! There are times when the main character syndrome makes sense when interconnected with the story or the thematic mechanics, but often it is a way to make the player responsible for doing everything. Oh, come on! Harbinger! Assume indirect control! The MCS is almost always detrimental, as games place all of the responsibility, stress, and duty onto the player, and hardly give any responsibility or competence to the allies. Usually, the allies are made immortal, because trying to keep allies alive is nearly impossible as their AI tells them to run in the pits of lava. Some developers will try to mitigate the lava baths by making the companions often first go into safety or entirely off screen, immediately during conflict encounters, which puts the onus of the battle primarily, or entirely, on the player, creating a likely chance of death and having to redo all that nonsense again, because thank you game, why did you give me companions if I can't use them? At least let them be cannon fodder, man! In order to make the player feel more like the hero, the allies will usually have terrible damage, terrible accuracy, attack at random events, terrible ideas, generally just be fumbling around like buffoons, which are all detrimental mechanics themselves, but it also means that the allies are barely assisting the player, while the enemies march onto the player with every weapon known to mankind. Other than combat, the MCS also means that the player will also be the one running through the minefields to disarm the alarm, while the leader of the revolution sits by and watches. This is important to give the player the fun and important parts to feel like a hero, but it can also be exhausting to do everything and be responsible for all the dangers when there are more fit people for the situation. In essence, the MCS forces the player to do everything in the game, but also requires that they suffer all the dangers, while the allies sit back and wait for the player to kill an entire army. In short, the MCS is supposed to make the player feel like the hero, but comes with the cost of all the burdens and struggles of the game, and potentially breaks the thematic and story elements by having all these important players do nothing in the game except tell this weird youngling who actually just showed up out of nowhere to do everything at every important event ever. Unlike most videos where I show a good and bad game or good and bad example, I'm actually going to give two detrimental mechanics that both help the game in some facet but are completely different in their either execution or their form. And the reason I'm doing this is because if it's a bad detrimental mechanic, you can probably figure out what's going to happen. It's just going to be frustrating, it's going to be annoying, and the game isn't going to flow properly. So that's usually what happens. So instead, I'm going to give two good examples. Piper, where are you? You are useless. Absolutely useless. Unraveled is designed around a specific detrimental mechanic where the character is a spool of yarn and can only move so far before losing all of that yarn and needs to collect more to rebuild his body because he'll become unraveled. That's the name of the game. The game is a platformer with no combat, which means that the levels are designed with hazards and puzzles. All the hazards make the player consider their movements and figure out how to build mechanisms to cross the hazards. The levels become winding and complex later on, meaning that the player has to stop and think of the most efficient path to avoid running out of yarn. When the enemies do appear, the player needs to find cover and defenses to escape death. The game is full of detrimentals which add actual challenge to the game. Without the hazards or enemies or limited movement, the game would just be the player running from left to right without much thought, which, you know, can be a good game, but really wouldn't work for this one. F-Zero is full of detrimentals in a much different way. The racing game is one where the defensive cars have hardly any impulse or effect from the collision with the player, and the opponents can correct any change immediately, while the player is often sent flying off and to the side. The edges of the map are lined with damaging lasers which also slow the player down, which are there to punish the player for having poor control and trying to take the short path by using the innermost part of the road. There are various other traps throughout the levels, some of which just slow the player down, others which damage and slow them down. If the player is so far ahead of the rest, the player will encounter cars which will explode upon contact. The game is designed around risky play and limits the player in various ways to make the races more diverse, but also allows the players to take easier routes but risk being overpassed by the opponents. Detrimental mechanics have their purpose in limiting the player to increase difficulty, create growth or flow, or compel the player to master the difficult aspects of the game. These mechanics can quickly become overwhelming and frustrating, making it appear as if the developers are just making things difficult for no reason. So, be careful when you're implementing too many or too intense limitations. If you're enacting the MCS, make sure that there is a reason, and that it doesn't just make the game too obnoxious to play while being targeted. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. If there's any constructive criticism that you have, anything that you think that I missed, or games that emulate good or bad MCS, good or bad defense always wins, or good or bad detrimentals, please put them in the comment section below so that we can continue this discourse. However, until next time where we talk about the guiding mechanics, Wale te omnes.